Good evening. I'm Nouriel Bremmer. A day ago, I walked you through what happened in Venezuela, the military operation, the arrest of Nicolas Maduro, the strategic calculations behind it. Today, I need to tell you about what's happened since, because something unexpected occurred in the global oil markets, something that perfectly illustrates why economic pressure campaigns so often produce the opposite of their intended results. Chinese oil buyers stopped purchasing Venezuelan crude, just as Washington hoped. But they didn't stop buying sanctioned oil. They simply switched suppliers from Venezuela to Iran. And in that switch, that quiet, rational business decision made by refinery managers in coastal China, lies a lesson about how modern economic power actually works, or more accurately, how it doesn't work the way policymakers in Washington seem to think it does. If you're wondering why this matters to you, let me be direct. The Venezuela operation was sold as securing American interests, stabilizing energy markets, and weakening adversaries. But what actually happened is that Iran, one of America's most hostile opponents, just gained market share and revenue, the very outcome the operation was supposed to prevent. And if you're concerned about where your tax dollars are going, about whether these foreign policy decisions make you safer or just create more problems, about what happens when strategy and reality collide, then this is a story you need to understand. Because this isn't just about Venezuela anymore. This is about whether American economic power can still shape global markets or whether markets have learned to adapt faster than Washington can control them. I spent 3 decades working in international finance and economic policy, and one thing I learned early is this: markets don't care about politics. They care about margins, they care about supply and demand, they care about price, and when you try to use political pressure to override basic economic incentives, the market doesn't comply. It adapts, it finds another way, and very often, that adaptation creates consequences nobody planned for. That's what we're seeing right now. Venezuela was supposed to be a demonstration of American power. Instead, it's becoming a demonstration of American limits. Not because the military operation failed, it succeeded tactically, but because the broader strategic goal, controlling oil flows and maintaining economic leverage, didn't happen the way it was supposed to. So today, I'm going to walk you through what's actually unfolding in global oil markets, how Chinese refiners made their calculation, why Iran is benefiting, what it means when sanctions redirect trade rather than stop it, and what all of this tells us about the effectiveness of economic pressure as a tool of foreign policy. This isn't partisan commentary. This is economics. And the numbers tell a story that official press releases don't. Let's begin. First, let me remind you what the Venezuela operation was supposed to achieve. The public narrative was straightforward. Nicolas Maduro was a criminal, a narco-terrorist, a dictator who had destroyed his country. The United States would remove him, restore democracy, stabilize the region, and secure Venezuelan oil for friendly markets. That was the story told at press conferences and in official statements. But the real strategic objective, the one that matters economically, was different. The operation wasn't primarily about Maduro, it was about China. Here's what I mean. For years, China has been Venezuela's largest oil customer. Chinese companies provided financing in exchange for guaranteed crude supplies. Chinese refiners bought Venezuelan heavy oil at steep discounts. And critically, those transactions increasingly happened outside the dollar system, paid in yuan, processed through Chinese banks, settled through payment networks that Washington doesn't control. From Washington's perspective, this was unacceptable for 2 reasons. First, it gave China independent access to energy in the Western Hemisphere, energy that didn't flow through channels the United States could monitor or control. Second, it demonstrated that you could trade oil outside the dollar system and survive. That's a precedent Washington couldn't allow to spread, because if other oil producers saw Venezuela successfully operating outside dollar-based trade, they might try the same thing. So the Venezuela operation had a broader purpose: deny China access to Western Hemisphere energy, force oil trade back into dollar-denominated channels, and prove that American economic pressure still works. The military operation succeeded. Maduro's in custody. The government in Caracas is in chaos. Venezuelan oil shipments to Asia have stopped. But here's where it gets interesting. China's response wasn't military. It wasn't diplomatic. It was purely economic. Chinese oil buyers simply found alternative suppliers. They adjusted their supply chains, and they did it faster than U.S. policymakers expected. This is the part that doesn't get discussed much in mainstream coverage, but it's the most important part of the story, because what's unfolding now isn't about whether Maduro was good or bad. It's about whether the United States can use economic pressure to reshape how global markets function. And the early evidence suggests the answer is not the way Washington thinks it can. Let me explain what happened. Chinese independent refiners, they're called teapots in industry terminology, are major buyers of discounted sanctioned oil. These are smaller refineries that operate on thin profit margins. They need cheap crude to stay competitive. For years, Venezuelan oil was perfect for them. It's heavy crude, thick, high in sulfur, exactly what their refineries are designed to process. And because Venezuela was under sanctions, the oil sold at steep discounts, sometimes $15 to $20 per barrel below market price. According to industry data, China was importing about 389,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil in early 2025. That's roughly 4% of China's total seaborne crude imports. Not a huge share, but strategically important. Then the U.S. blockade tightened. Tanker seizures increased. Loadings for Asian destinations at Venezuelan ports stopped completely after January 1st. So Chinese refiners faced a problem. They still needed cheap, heavy crude, but their Venezuelan supply was cut off. What did they do? They switched suppliers. From Venezuela to Iran, same product, heavy crude, same discount, about $10 per barrel below benchmark prices. Same payment methods, outside the dollar system, just a different country of origin. And here's the critical insight. This wasn't a political decision. It was an economic one. Chinese refiners looked at their options and made a rational choice based on price and availability. Capital doesn't care about politics. It cares about margins. Now, let me walk you through why this represents such a significant strategic miscalculation. Because this isn't just about one supply chain adjustment. This is about how sanctions actually work versus how policymakers think they work. Many of you will remember the oil shocks of the 1970s, when OPEC cut production, when prices spiked, when gas lines formed around blocks. That was a different kind of supply disruption, coordinated, intentional, designed to use oil as a political weapon. What we're seeing now is different. This is market adaptation in real time, and it's happening faster than the policy response can keep up with. Here's the mechanism. When the United States eased sanctions on Venezuela briefly in late 2023 and early 2024, something interesting happened. Venezuelan oil prices rose. The discount narrowed from about $15 per barrel below market to about $10 below. That made Venezuelan crude less attractive to cost-conscious Chinese buyers. The economic advantage shrank. Meanwhile, Iran, which remained under full U.S. sanctions the entire time, kept its oil priced at steep discounts. Iranian heavy crude stayed at $10 to $12 below benchmark prices. Iranian extra heavy was even cheaper. So when U.S. pressure on Venezuela intensified again when the blockade tightened in January 2025, Chinese buyers looked at the numbers. Venezuelan oil, risky, potentially unavailable, $10 discount, increasing seizure risk. Iranian oil, also sanctioned but flowing reliably, same $10 discount, ample supply. Established delivery networks. The choice was obvious. Now, here's where this becomes a strategic failure rather than just a supply chain adjustment. The United States didn't just fail to stop Chinese buyers from purchasing sanctioned oil. It redirected that trade to one of America's most hostile adversaries. Think about that for a moment. The Venezuela operation was designed to weaken countries that oppose U.S. interests. Instead, it strengthened Iran, a country that funds proxy forces throughout the Middle East. that provides drones and missiles being used against American interests that Washington has spent 45 years trying to isolate. According to analysts at Sparta Commodities, the Venezuela disruption is hitting Chinese independent refineries hardest because they're losing access to discounted heavy crude. But because ample Russian and Iranian feedstocks are available, these refineries don't need to bid up prices for unsanctioned alternatives. They simply switch suppliers. Kepler, another energy market analysis firm, notes that Chinese refiners processing Venezuelan oil are expected to switch mainly to Russian and Iranian grades. Iranian heavy crude remains the cheapest alternative. So the United States tried to punish Caracas. It accidentally subsidized Tehran. Let me explain what I mean by subsidized, because this is important. When you remove a supplier from the market, in this case Venezuela, but demand stays constant, the remaining suppliers gain market share. Iranian oil that might have competed with Venezuelan crude for Chinese buyers no longer has that competition. Iran's market position strengthens. More market share means more revenue. More revenue for Iran means more resources for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. More resources for the IRGC means more drones, more missiles, more capability to fund proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. The same drones that U.S. Navy ships are now intercepting in the Red Sea cost money to build. The same missiles targeting shipping lanes require funding. The proxy networks destabilizing the region need financial support. And here's the painful irony. The Venezuela operation just helped provide that funding. This isn't speculation. This is accounting. When Iranian oil exports increase, when Tehran gains additional revenue streams, that money flows into military capabilities. And the United States is now in the position of spending money, your tax dollars, to intercept weapons that its own sanctions policy inadvertently helped finance. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying this was the intention. Nobody in Washington planned to strengthen Iran, but intention doesn't matter when we're assessing outcomes. And the outcome is that Iran's economic position just improved because of a U.S. operation aimed at a completely different country. This is what economists call an unintended consequence. But at this scale, with these implications, unintended starts to look a lot like poorly planned. Let me give you a historical parallel because some of you may remember a similar pattern. In the 1980s, the United States funded and armed Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan to oppose the Soviet Union. That made sense at the time from a Cold War perspective, weaken the Soviets by supporting their opponents. But 20 years later, some of those same fighters and weapons networks became the foundation for organizations that attacked American interests, including on September 11, 2001. Nobody in the 1980s planned that outcome, but it happened because policies have consequences that ripple forward in time, often in ways that contradict the original intent. What we're seeing with Venezuela and Iran isn't identical, but the pattern is similar. Actions taken to weaken one adversary end up strengthening another. And then you spend decades and trillions of dollars dealing with the consequences. So here's the question you're probably asking. If this isn't working the way it was supposed to, why continue? Why double down with blockades, tanker seizures, and confrontations with Russia? The answer is credibility, or more precisely, the fear of losing credibility. Let me explain what I mean. In foreign policy and economics, credibility is a form of power. When the United States says we will sanction you if you do X, that threat only works if countries believe the U.S. will follow through and that the sanctions will hurt. For decades, that credibility was real. Being cut off from dollar-based financial systems, being unable to trade with American companies, losing access to U.S. markets, those were severe penalties that most countries wanted to avoid. But that credibility has been eroding, not because the sanctions got weaker, but because the world got better at working around them. Russia, after being sanctioned heavily following the Ukraine conflict, built alternative payment systems. China developed its CIPS network for international transactions that bypass SWIFT. India negotiates rupee-based trade deals. The UAE processes billions in local currency transactions. The sanctions toolkit still exists, but it's less frightening than it used to be. Countries have learned they can survive outside the dollar system if they're willing to adapt. And that's where Venezuela comes in. If the Trump administration backs off now, if it lets the situation stabilize with oil flowing back to China, if Maduro's successor consolidates power, if the operation is seen as incomplete or failed, then every country watching draws a conclusion: you can resist U.S. pressure and survive. You can wait it out. Washington will eventually move on to the next crisis. That lesson would be devastating for American economic leverage, because once countries stop fearing sanctions, the sanctions stop working. And if sanctions stop working, the United States loses a major tool of influence. So Venezuela becomes more than just Venezuela. It becomes a test case for whether American economic coercion still functions. If Venezuela pressure fails, other countries take note. Iran becomes more bold. Russia becomes more resistant. China accelerates its efforts to build alternative systems. Every adversary and competitor learns the same lesson. That's why President Trump can't just let this go, even as evidence accumulates that the operation isn't achieving its strategic goals. Because admitting failure or even pivoting to a different approach would signal weakness. Now, I need to say something that might be uncomfortable to hear. This dynamic, where credibility concerns drive policy even when the policy isn't working, is dangerous because it leads to escalation for its own sake, not because escalation solves the problem, but because backing down looks weak. You see this pattern throughout history. Wars that continued longer than they should have because no one wanted to be the leader who lost. Conflicts that escalated because retreat seemed politically impossible. And right now, Venezuela is heading in that direction. The blockade continues. Tanker seizures increase. Confrontations with Russian naval escorts create ongoing risks. All of this costs money, creates tension, strains alliances, but it continues because the alternative, admitting this approach isn't working, seems worse politically than continuing down an ineffective path. Let me make this personal for a moment because I think it's important. Many of you served in the military or knew people who did. You understand that when military force gets deployed, there's a human cost and a financial cost. Young men and women in uniform don't choose these missions. Political leaders do. And when those missions don't achieve their objectives, when they create more problems than they solve, when the strategic logic falls apart, that's not the fault of the sailors on those ships or the air crews flying missions. That's a policy failure. What we're seeing in Venezuela is policy that isn't matching reality. Markets are adapting faster than the policy response. And rather than adjust the policy, rather than acknowledge that economic coercion has limits, the response is to escalate enforcement, more seizures, more blockades, more confrontation. But enforcement can't change underlying economics. Chinese refiners need cheap crude. Iranian suppliers can provide it. That equation doesn't change because the U.S. Navy seizes tankers. So we're left with a situation where the policy continues not because it's working, but because stopping it looks like failure. Now let me show you what's actually happening in global oil markets, because this is where the economics become very clear. Before the Venezuela operation, the oil trade looked like this. Venezuela produced roughly 780,000 barrels per day. About half of that went to China, purchased by independent refiners. Revenue stayed in Caracas. China had access to cheap Western Hemisphere heavy crude. After the operation, the picture changed. Venezuelan oil exports to Asia stopped. Iranian oil exports to China increased by approximately the same volume. Revenue now flows to Tehran instead of Caracas. China still has access to cheap, heavy crude, just from a different source. The United States succeeded in cutting Venezuela off, but it didn't succeed in cutting China off from sanctioned oil supplies. The supply chain simply rerouted. And here's what makes this economically significant. The rerouting happened almost immediately. Within weeks of the blockade tightening, Chinese buyers had adjusted their contracts. That speed tells you something important. These alternative supply chains weren't built after the Venezuela operation. They already existed. China, anticipating exactly this kind of disruption, had spent years developing redundant supply networks. This is strategic planning. This is what it looks like when a major economy prepares for U.S. sanctions and builds systems specifically designed to work around them. Now, let's talk about what this means for American oil companies, because this is another area where political rhetoric and economic reality diverged. President Trump said American oil majors Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips would rush into Venezuela, invest billions, rebuild infrastructure, and bring production back online. But that hasn't happened, and it's not happening quickly. Why? Because corporations don't operate on political promises. They operate on guarantees. Before a major oil company invests billions of dollars in any country, they need certain things in place: legal protection from future sanctions, clear ownership structures, enforceable contracts, political stability, insurance coverage, access to capital markets, reliable security. None of those conditions exist in Venezuela right now. The government is in transition. We don't even know who's really in charge. Legal frameworks are uncertain. Insurance companies won't cover operations in what they consider a conflict zone. Banks won't finance projects without clarity about political risk. So while officials talk about American companies rebuilding Venezuelan oil production, the companies themselves are waiting. They're assessing. They're watching to see if the situation stabilizes. And I can tell you from experience, corporations are risk averse, especially when it comes to multi-billion-dollar investments in unstable regions. They want certainty. Until they have it, the money won't flow, which means Venezuelan oil production will stay disrupted for the foreseeable future, which means that gap in Chinese supply will persist, which means Iranian and Russian oil will continue filling it. This is real-world friction that political rhetoric ignores. You can remove a government, you can make promises about reconstruction, but you can't force private companies to invest in chaos. And this creates a paradox. The operation was supposed to secure Venezuelan oil for American interests. But because the aftermath is unstable, because investment won't happen quickly, Venezuelan oil production may stay offline for years. So the United States didn't secure the oil. It just removed it from global markets, creating a supply gap that Iran happily filled. Let me give you another data point that illustrates this pattern. According to shipping data, Iranian oil exports to China have increased by approximately 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day since the Venezuela operation began. That's almost exactly the volume of Venezuelan crude that Chinese refiners were purchasing before. That's not coincidence. That's substitution. The market adjusted. Demand stayed constant. Supply sources changed. And here's what this tells us about the effectiveness of sanctions in the 21st century. They don't work the way they used to. In the 1990s and 2000s, being cut off from Western financial systems was crippling. There weren't alternatives. If you couldn't use dollars, couldn't clear transactions through SWIFT, couldn't access Western banks, you were isolated. But over the past 15 years, alternative systems have been built. Payment networks that don't touch the dollar, banking relationships that bypass Western institutions, trade agreements denominated in local currencies. The infrastructure for sanctions evasion now exists, and it's sophisticated. So when the United States pressures one supplier, Venezuela, the market doesn't collapse. It adapts. Buyers shift to alternative sources. Money flows through alternative channels. The trade continues. This doesn't mean sanctions are useless. They still impose costs. They still create complications, but they're less decisive than they used to be. And that matters strategically, because if your primary tool of economic leverage is becoming less effective, you need to acknowledge that and adjust your approach. What we're seeing instead is escalation, more blockades, more seizures, more enforcement, trying to make an outdated strategy work through sheer force. But force can't change fundamentals. And the fundamental economic reality is this: Chinese refiners need cheap crude. They will buy it from whoever offers the best price. And right now, that's Iran. Now, let's talk about the broader diplomatic consequences, because these matter for American interests in ways that will last much longer than the Venezuela operation itself. Latin America's response has been significant. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, and Spain issued a joint condemnation, not individual statements, a coordinated response. That coordination tells you something. These aren't small countries with no international standing. Brazil is Latin America's largest economy. Mexico is a major U.S. trade partner. Colombia has been a close security ally for decades, and they all opposed this operation. President Gustavo Petro of Colombia said an attack on Venezuela is an attack on Latin America itself. President Lula of Brazil called it a dangerous precedent. Mexico's government invoked the UN Charter prohibition on the use of force. This is diplomatic cost. Countries that used to align with US policy, or at least remain neutral, are now actively opposing American actions. And here's why that matters for you personally. These diplomatic relationships affect trade, affect cooperation on migration, affect security coordination, affect the stability of a hemisphere where the United States has enormous economic interests. When your neighbors don't trust you, when they see you as unpredictable or aggressive, they start looking for alternative partnerships. And right now, that alternative is China. China doesn't lecture Latin American countries about their internal governance. China doesn't threaten military action. China offers infrastructure loans, trade deals, investment, and it does so without political conditions. From the perspective of a Brazilian or Colombian government official, that predictability is attractive, especially after watching what happened in Venezuela. So the diplomatic cost of this operation isn't just rhetorical condemnation. It's a slow realignment of economic and political relationships in the Western Hemisphere, away from automatic alignment with the United States toward more independent foreign policies that include substantial Chinese engagement. That's a strategic loss that will take years or decades to reverse. Europe's response has been more muted, but it's still revealing. Concern about precedent, emphasis on international law, but no concrete action. Why? Because Europe depends on the United States for security, particularly given the ongoing situation in Ukraine. European governments can't push too hard against American actions without risking the security relationship they need. So you get symbolic criticism without substance. And that reveals something important about the current international system. Major powers can act with relative impunity. International law has no real enforcement mechanism against the United States, Russia, or China. The UN Secretary General can warn about dangerous precedents. Smaller countries can vote to condemn. But functionally, nothing changes. That's not a stable foundation for international order, but it's the reality we're operating in. And every country watching draws conclusions about what that reality means for their own security and interest. Now, let me bring this home to what it means for Americans, particularly those of you approaching or in retirement, because these foreign policy decisions have real economic consequences. First, let's talk about energy costs. You haven't seen dramatic changes at the gas pump yet. Prices have stayed relatively stable. Why? Because Venezuelan oil production was already low before the operation, so removing it from markets didn't create a massive supply shock. But here's what you should watch for over the next 6 to 12 months. If Venezuelan production stays offline, which seems likely given the political instability and lack of investment, and if Iranian production ramps up to fill Chinese demand, which is happening, you're looking at a global oil market where more supply comes from countries under US sanctions. That makes supply chains more fragile. It makes prices more volatile. And volatility in energy markets filters through the entire economy. Transportation costs, heating costs, the price of goods that have to be shipped. You won't see this as one big price spike. You'll see it as persistent, unpredictable fluctuations that make it harder to budget and plan. Second, let's talk about defense spending. Every aircraft carrier deployment costs about $6.5 million per day. Maintaining a blockade requires multiple ships, aircraft logistics support. Seizing tankers requires specialized operations. All of this costs money. Money that comes from the federal budget. Money that could otherwise go to other priorities. Infrastructure, healthcare, reducing the deficit. I'm not making a political argument about what spending priorities should be. I'm making an accounting observation. Military operations are expensive. And when those operations don't achieve their strategic objectives, you're spending money without getting the intended return. Third, and this is the long-term concern, dollar dominance is eroding. Every time a country decides to reduce its dependence on dollar-based systems, because they see how the U.S. weaponizes those systems, demand for dollars decreases slightly. That decline is gradual. It happens at the margins, but over years and decades, it matters. Why? Because dollar dominance is what allows the United States to borrow enormous sums at relatively low interest rates. Foreign governments and institutions want to hold dollars and dollar-denominated assets like treasury bonds. That demand keeps U.S. borrowing costs down. As demand declines, borrowing costs rise. Higher borrowing costs mean it's more expensive to finance government operations. That eventually shows up as higher taxes, reduced services, less fiscal flexibility. This isn't an immediate crisis. The dollar isn't collapsing, but the trend is clear, and the Venezuela operation just accelerated it because it demonstrated to watching countries exactly why they should reduce dollar dependence. China saw, use the dollar system and the U.S. can pressure you through sanctions. Iran saw, operate outside the dollar system and you can survive. Latin America saw, align too closely with Washington and you might be the next target. Each of those observations pushes countries toward alternative systems, and each step toward alternatives reduces the long-term economic advantage the United States has enjoyed for 50 years. Now, I want to address something more personal because I think it matters. Many of you served your country or raised children who did. You understand sacrifice, you understand duty. And I think there's a growing sense among people your age that recent foreign policy decisions, the wars, the interventions, the operations, haven't served American interests well. Iraq didn't make us safer. Afghanistan didn't end the way we were told it would. Libya descended into chaos. Syria remains a mess. And now Venezuela, an operation that was supposed to secure oil and weaken adversaries, has ended up strengthening Iran and alienating allies. At some point, you're entitled to ask, are the people making these decisions learning from past mistakes, or are they repeating the same patterns? I don't have a comfortable answer to that question. What I can tell you is that the pattern we're seeing, using military force to solve economic problems, escalating when the initial approach doesn't work, prioritizing credibility over effectiveness, that pattern has a history, and the history isn't encouraging. The human cost gets paid by service members deployed far from home. The financial cost gets paid through your taxes. The diplomatic cost gets paid through strained relationships that make future cooperation harder. And the strategic cost, the erosion of American influence, the acceleration of alternative systems, the alienation of allies, that cost accumulates slowly, but it's real. So when you hear officials talking about the Venezuela operation as a success, I'd encourage you to ask, success by what measure? Maduro is in custody. That's true. But oil still flows to China, just from Iran instead of Venezuela. Sanctions credibility hasn't been restored. It's been questioned. American companies haven't rushed in to rebuild. They're waiting for stability that may not come for years. Iran has been weakened. No, it's been strengthened. Regional allies have been reassured. No, they've been alienated. Those aren't my political opinions. Those are observable outcomes, and you're entitled to judge whether those outcomes justify the costs. Let me walk you through 3 scenarios for how this develops over the next 6 to 12 months, because understanding possibilities helps you think about what to watch for. Scenario 1. Escalation. In this path, President Trump doubles down. The blockade tightens further. More tankers get seized. Confrontations with Russian naval escorts intensify. The U.S. expands the operation to include secondary sanctions, penalties for any country or company that buys Venezuelan oil through sanctions evasion. This would increase pressure, but it would also increase costs and risks. More military deployment, more diplomatic friction, higher chance of an accident or miscalculation that creates a broader crisis. In this scenario, Iranian oil exports might face renewed U.S. pressure as Washington tries to shut down the alternative supply chain. But that would require European cooperation, which is uncertain, and it would require China to comply, which is unlikely. The risk here is that escalation doesn't achieve the strategic goal, controlling oil flows. It just creates more conflict. Probability, 30–35%. Trump's instinct when facing resistance is usually to escalate, but military and economic advisors may push back given the lack of results so far. Scenario 2, manage stalemate. In this path, the current situation continues without major escalation, but without resolution. The blockade remains. Venezuelan production stays disrupted. Iranian oil continues flowing to China. Diplomatic tensions persist but don't explode. U.S. oil companies wait for political clarity that never quite arrives. The transitional government in Caracas struggles to consolidate power. Latin American countries maintain their opposition but don't actively counter U.S. actions. This is the muddle-through scenario. Nothing gets resolved, but nothing collapses either. It just persists, accumulating costs over time. In this scenario, energy markets adjust to the new normal. Iranian market share stabilizes at a higher level. Venezuelan production eventually recovers partially, but much later and at much lower volumes than optimistic projections suggested. Probability, 45–50%. This is unfortunately the most likely outcome because it requires no difficult decisions, just bureaucratic momentum. Scenario 3, strategic pivoting. This path, the administration acknowledges that the current approach isn't achieving its goals and adjusts. Maybe not publicly. Presidents rarely admit failure explicitly, but in practice, the blockade loosens. Enforcement becomes less aggressive. Quiet negotiations begin with whoever emerges as the stable power in Caracas. The focus shifts from regime change to managing relationships and securing specific outcomes, counter narcotics cooperation, some oil access, reduce Chinese influence, but not elimination of it. This would require political courage to change course. It would require accepting that maximalist objectives aren't achievable, but it would reduce costs, reduce risks, and potentially achieve more realistic goals. In this scenario, Venezuelan oil eventually flows again to multiple buyers, including China. The U.S. gets some access through companies like Chevron. The diplomatic damage with Latin America begins to heal. Iran's market share advantage persists but doesn't expand further. Probability 15–20%. This would be the wise choice strategically, but it's politically difficult because changing course looks like weakness. What to watch over? The next 3 months, here's what will tell you which path we're on. First, tanker seizure frequency. If seizures increase, we're heading towards scenario 1. If they decline, we might be moving towards scenario 3. Second, statements from Latin American leaders. If diplomatic opposition intensifies, if countries start active countermeasures like refusing overflight rights or port access that pushes toward escalation, if statements soften, we might be heading towards stalemate. Third, Iranian oil export data. If Tehran's exports to China continue increasing, that tells you the market adaptation is consolidating. If they plateau, maybe U.S. pressure is finding some effectiveness. Fourth, investment announcements from oil majors. If companies like Chevron or ExxonMobil announce concrete plans for Venezuelan operations with timelines and dollar figures, that would signal someone believes stability is coming. If no announcements come, that tells you corporate America doesn't see stability on the horizon. Those indicators will tell you more than official statements about which direction this is actually heading. Closing 44,430, 4730, 500 words. Let me bring this together. The Venezuela operation succeeded tactically. The military mission was executed effectively. Maduro is in custody. But strategically, the operation hasn't achieved its core objectives. Oil still flows to China, just from Iran instead of Venezuela. Sanctions credibility hasn't been restored. Market adaptation has actually undermined it. American companies haven't rushed in. Uncertainty keeps them waiting. Regional allies haven't been reassured. They've been alarmed. And most significantly, one of America's most hostile adversaries, Iran, has been strengthened rather than weakened. Those aren't partisan criticisms. Those are observable outcomes. Now, does this mean the operation was wrong? That's a political and moral judgment that each person has to make for themselves. What I can say as an economist and former policy analyst is this: the operation revealed limits, limits of what sanctions can achieve when alternative systems exist, limits of what military force can secure when markets adapt faster than enforcement, limits of what economic coercion can accomplish when the costs of resistance have decreased. Those limits matter because they define what's possible. And right now, what's possible is narrower than many in Washington want to admit. The fundamental question that the Venezuela operation raised and hasn't answered is this: if you remove a leader but don't change the economic forces that empowered him, what exactly have you accomplished? Maduro is gone, but Chinese refiners are still buying sanctioned oil, just from different suppliers. And one of those suppliers is a country that actively opposes American interests across an entire region. That's not success by any strategic measure I know how to apply. The operation continues. The blockade persists. The diplomatic fallout spreads. But the market has already adapted. And that adaptation, quick, rational, economically logical, tells us something important about the world we're operating in now. Economic networks are resilient. They route around disruptions. They find alternative pathways, and they respond to incentives more powerfully than they respond to pressure. Understanding that doesn't mean accepting it, but it does mean recognizing it. Because policy that ignores economic reality tends to produce outcomes very different from what was intended. Next week, I'll be looking at what's happening with currency systems more broadly, how the dollar's role is evolving, what that means for American economic power, and how you should think about positioning for a world where reserve currency status is no longer guaranteed. If you found this analysis useful, please subscribe. I publish detailed briefings like this twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. My goal is to help you understand how global economic forces affect your daily life, your savings, your security, not through partisan rhetoric, but through clear analysis of what's actually happening. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm Nouriel Bremmer, and I'll see you next time.